Hello and welcome to another 9-minute Bible study. Our starting point, Acts chapter 9, verse 40. How did we get to this point? Peter is on a road trip. He first stopped in Lydda. There was a man named Aeneas. He had the palsy. Peter said, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." He rose, picked up his bed, and walked. Once the town of Joppa, the church there, heard that Peter was in town, and once Dorcas, a key member of the church, had passed away, the church sent 2 men to get Peter to Joppa to pray for Dorcas. Now, what did we see? Verse 40. But Peter put them all forth. Remember, this is what Jesus did with Jairus' daughter. He put everyone out of the room except for Peter, James, John, and the girl's parents. Here we see Peter doing exactly what Jesus taught him to do in taking command of the situation. The room had to be a place full of faith. This is not a time when you're dealing with someone like Dorcas, who is dead, to deal with not having faith, dealing with doubt, dealing with tears and weeping and crying and mourning. This was a time of faith. And what happened? And turning him to the body said, "Tabitha, arise." In faith, knowing what the Lord will do, he looked at Tabitha and told her, "Arise." He told her basically the same thing that he told Aeneas, except this time the Lord moved in a very mighty way. What do you mean by that? And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. She was raised from the dead. We see once again the signs, the wonders, the power in the ministry of Peter and in the local church. And she gave her his hand and lifted her up, and when she had called the saints and widows, presented her alive. And it was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. The same thing that we saw in Lydda, we see at Joppa. Signs, wonders, equals souls being won to Jesus. The church growing and prospering. Now, let's look at the bigger picture. I don't think Peter, when he left Jerusalem and wound up in Lydda, was thinking about entering into phase 4. He was in the middle of his preaching tour. He does not realize that he is being led by the Lord to where he needed to be for chapter 10 to begin. Sometimes the Lord moves in such a way that the believer, the minister, is put in a certain time, at a certain place, for a certain reason. Now, it would have been a great move, a great meeting in Lydda if Aeneas was the only one who got up off his bed and walked and souls were saved. It would have been a great experience in Joppa just with Dorcas or Tabitha getting off her deathbed and being part of the church again. But the Lord had a greater purpose in getting Peter to where he needed to be. In short, all things work together for good to those who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. Let me add one part of the plan of God. Peter was exactly where he needed to be as chapter 10 begins. That would be what? Last verse of chapter 9. And it came to pass that he tarried many days in Joppa with one Simon the tanner. Chapter 10, verse 1. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band. Caesarea, unlike the rest of the towns in Judea, basically is a Roman city. It was established by the Romans to show Roman culture throughout the region. This is also the place where the Roman government ruled the region. And yes, this is a place where the Roman garrisons, the troops, were stationed. This is a major Roman place. This is usually not a place where we read a lot about the church and the believers. Yet here we see the beginning of phase 4, changing from reaching Judea and Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth. Verse 2. A devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people, and prayed to God always. Now, Cornelius, let's make this point clear. He is a Gentile. He is not a Jew by ancestry. He is one who in his own house, yes, he prays, he gives offerings, he would be considered a good man, but in the eyes of the Jews, he's still a Gentile, and he is lost. He is also not a part of the church. From what we can tell from the flow of the chapter, he has very little knowledge about Christianity coming into the beginning of this chapter. What he is, he's a good man. But as we're going to see, a good man doesn't really mean that much. Even those that we consider good, they must believe in Jesus at some point or another. Verse 3. He saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming in to him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid. And who wouldn't be afraid? Angels don't exactly drop in and start making themselves known on a daily occasion. And said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Your prayers and your alms are come up for a memorial before God. God heard the prayers. But there is another shoe that's going to drop here. Verse 5. Now send men to Joppa, and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter, who lodges with one Simon a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell you all that you ought to do. As good as Cornelius was, as much as God heard the prayer, he still needed to hear the gospel message. And he needed to hear this gospel message not from an angel, but from a person. That's why we see the command to go, send men to Joppa, and bring Peter to your house in Caesarea. The gospel needed to be preached by a believer for souls to be saved. The gospel needs to be preached by believers. This is important and key to the growth of the church. And we'll pick up with this in our next lesson.